Paris, in the year 1896, was a city that dazzled the world. Electric lights shimmered on the wide boulevards, café society thrived with poets, painters, and scientists, and the city proudly wore the crown of the Belle Epoque. Yet for all its splendor, Paris also had shadows, places where progress and glamour never penetrated. Hidden behind the grandeur of the boulevards stood vast institutional walls, cold, grey, and foreboding. Within them were housed the forgotten people of society, the poor, the insane, the incurably ill. For most Parisians, these asylums were simply a rumor, an ugly necessity that was never to be spoken of in polite conversation. But in one such asylum, in that very year of 1896, a nurse was said to be writing a darker story than anyone outside could imagine. She was not a famous figure. No portraits survive, no monuments carry her name. What we know of her is stitched together from fragmented ledgers, whispers in asylum corridors, and vague mentions in forgotten reports. Yet her shadow looms large over one of the most unsettling mysteries in the history of French medicine. Patients under her care seemed to wither away at alarming rates. Many were buried quickly, without ceremony, their records signed off with chillingly generic causes of death: exhaustion, melancholia, failure of the nerves. To some, it was nothing unusual. After all, death was a constant companion in the wards of the insane. But to others, it seemed that this particular nurse had far too much proximity to the grave. In Paris of the 1890s, nursing was itself a precarious profession. Nurses worked in punishing conditions, with long hours, poor pay, and little recognition. They were expected to serve as both caretakers and wardens, balancing compassion with authority. But what happens when the one entrusted with such authority decides to bend it, to twist it, perhaps even to exploit it? The whispers claimed this nurse did exactly that. Not only did she tend to patients, but she also ensured that many never left her ward alive. And when the time came to bury them, she was there as well, standing at the graveside, supervising burials, perhaps to make certain that her secrets were sealed beneath the soil along with the bodies. This story is not just about one woman. It is about the institutions that shielded her, the medical systems that failed their most vulnerable, and a society eager to look the other way. To the outside world, Paris in 1896 was a marvel of modernity. But inside the asylum walls, time seemed frozen in an older, crueler age. The methods of treatment were primitive at best, brutal at worst. Patients were strapped into cold baths, fed strong sedatives, or confined to darkened cells. Their cries were muffled by thick stone walls, their individuality erased by medical labels. If a patient died, the city did not mourn, it barely noticed. And in such an environment, how easy would it be for a nurse to hasten that death and walk away unquestioned? The tale of the nurse who buried secrets is compelling not because it was a grand scandal splashed across the front pages of newspapers, but because it remained hidden. It was a crime, if indeed it was a crime, that was allowed to vanish into silence. And that silence speaks volumes. The asylum ledger, dry and bureaucratic, is our only witness now. On its yellowed pages, in faded ink, lies the pattern: names entered, conditions recorded, deaths noted, and the final resting places reduced to single lines of bureaucratic shorthand. No testimonies from the patients survive. They had no voice. But the nurse's hand appears again and again, signing off on the endings of lives that never had a chance to begin anew. Why tell this story now? Because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. The Belle Epoque is celebrated for its art, its elegance, and its spirit of progress, but this story reminds us of the people left behind, those institutionalized and silenced. It also forces us to ask unsettling questions. How many deaths went unnoticed? How many crimes were masked by the language of medicine? And how many nurses, doctors, or attendants throughout history exploited the same blind spots in systems designed to protect them? The mystery of this Parisian nurse remains unresolved. No trial, no conviction, no confession. Her name may have faded, but her story lingers like a stain on the bright canvas of 1896 Paris. As we step into the corridors of her asylum, guided by the whispers left in ledgers and reports, we must be prepared to see both the cruelty of the institution and the ambiguity of human nature. Was she a cold-blooded predator hiding in plain sight, exploiting her role to mask murder? Or was she merely a woman crushed under the unbearable weight of a broken system, a scapegoat for the failings of the asylum itself? This documentary will not provide easy answers. Instead, it will peel back the layers of history, science, and rumor to reconstruct what little remains. The nurse may never be named, but her presence can still be felt, haunting the records, lingering in the shadows of the wards, waiting in the silence of unmarked graves. Paris in 1896 sparkled with electric brilliance, but in one forgotten corner, a nurse was burying her patients, and with them, her secrets. To understand how the nurse of 1896 could operate in the shadows of Paris, we must first step back and examine the world she inhabited, a world often remembered only for its glitter, its art, and its optimism. The Belle Epoque, as historians call it, stretched from the late 19th century until the First World War. It was a golden age for the upper classes of Paris, a time of new inventions, flourishing culture, and seemingly endless prosperity. The Eiffel Tower had already risen as a modern icon, the Paris metro was under construction, and cabarets like the Moulin Rouge entertained audiences with dazzling lights and music. But behind this facade of progress, there lurked a parallel reality that most Parisians preferred not to see. Mental illness during this period was a matter of both fascination and fear. On one hand, French medicine prided itself on advances in psychiatry. The name of Jean-Martin Charcot, the famous neurologist of the Salpêtrière Hospital, was known across Europe. He staged lectures and demonstrations of hysteria that fascinated medical students, artists, and even writers like Sigmund Freud. To the educated elite, madness was a subject of clinical study, an exotic puzzle to be solved. But for ordinary citizens, insanity was still shrouded in stigma and dread. The mad were considered dangerous, unpredictable, and best hidden from polite society. Families who could not manage a troubled relative would quietly send them to an institution, hoping never to see them again. These asylums were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were sprawling, fortress-like structures designed less for healing than for confinement. Paris alone had several, Sainte Anne, Bicester, and the vast Salpêtrière, each housing thousands of patients. Once admitted, few ever left. The public viewed these places as warehouses for the unwanted. The sick, the destitute, and the mentally ill were mixed together, their individuality erased beneath institutional labels. Within their walls, the ideal of treatment coexisted uneasily with neglect, experimentation, and quiet brutality. The treatments available in 1896 were primitive by today's standards. Patients might be restrained with leather straps or placed in padded cells to calm them. Hydrotherapy was widely used. Long baths in cold or tepid water, sometimes for hours, intended to soothe agitated minds. Sedatives such as chloral hydrate or laudanum were administered liberally, sometimes to the point of stupor. Feeding could be withheld as a form of control, or forced through crude methods when patients refused to eat. In some cases, experimental surgeries, such as trepanation or even early lobotomies, were attempted, though these were rare in France compared to later decades. The line between medical treatment and punishment was thin, and in some wards, it all but vanished. The environment itself contributed to suffering. Overcrowding was chronic. Asylum populations in Paris often doubled or tripled the intended capacity. Dormitories housed dozens of patients in close quarters, with poor sanitation and inadequate ventilation. Outbreaks of tuberculosis, influenza, and other contagious diseases were common, and death was expected. For staff, this created a dangerous complacency. If patients died frequently anyway, who would question an unusual cluster of deaths under one nurse's care? Culturally, the stigma of madness made oversight even weaker. The patients were not considered citizens in any meaningful sense. They had no vote, no voice, and no advocates. Families who placed them in the asylum often cut ties, whether out of shame or financial necessity. When a patient died, there were rarely visitors to ask questions. Many were buried in common graves, their names recorded only in ledgers. This indifference provided fertile ground for neglect, and possibly for deliberate harm. At the same time, Paris was enthralled by the spectacle of modern science. Newspapers celebrated discoveries in microbiology, electricity, and medicine. Doctors were held in irreverence, seen as custodians of truth and progress. Nurses and attendants, though less celebrated, still enjoyed a measure of authority in the closed world of the asylum. Their word carried weight. Their signatures on death records were rarely challenged. For a nurse with darker intentions, this trust created opportunity. She could conceal her actions under the veil of medical authority, hidden behind the jargon of diagnoses and the indifference of a system overloaded with bodies. The Belle Epoque is remembered today as a time of joy and confidence, but in the asylums, the atmosphere was very different. The optimism of progress stopped at the gates. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of disinfectant and disease. The cries of the distressed echoed down stone corridors, muffled by thick walls. The daily routine was rigid, mechanical: feeding, bathing, sedating, restraining, sleeping. Patients became numbers in a ledger, their humanity stripped away by repetition and routine. Staff members, exhausted and underpaid, often hardened themselves against compassion. In this environment, the difference between a natural death and a suspicious one was easy to blur. And so, when we speak of the nurse who buried secrets, we must remember that she lived in this world. Her actions, whether of malice, indifference, or desperation, were made possible by the cultural and institutional framework of her time. The Belle Epoque celebrated progress, but it also created blind spots, places where suffering could be ignored, where vulnerable people could disappear, and where a nurse's ledger might quietly record the steady march of death without ever raising alarm. The glittering streets of Paris may have dazzled the world in 1896, but the shadow of madness stretched far behind them. And in those shadows, in the wards of the asylum, a nurse's role could shift from healer to gatekeeper of the grave, unnoticed, unchallenged, and perhaps deliberately concealed. To understand the nurse's story in its full, haunting dimension, we must descend into the labyrinth of Paris's asylum system as it stood in 1896. These institutions were more than just hospitals. They were microcosms of society's fears, prejudices, and ambitions. They stood like grey fortresses on the edges of the city, their tall walls sealing away thousands of men and women whose only common trait was that society had no place for them. The asylum was at once a medical facility, a prison, a poorhouse, and, for many, a final resting place. Three names dominated the psychiatric landscape of Paris at the time: Bicester, Sainte-Anne, and La Salpêtrière. Each had its own infamous history. Bicester had once been a prison for beggars and criminals before becoming a hospital for the mentally ill. Its walls were scarred with centuries of cruelty. It was here that chains and cages had once been routine. La Salpêtrière was perhaps the most famous, a sprawling complex that housed thousands of women, some truly ill, others simply inconvenient to their families or deemed morally suspect. Under Jean-Martin Charcot, the Salpêtrière had become a stage for medical spectacle, where hysteria was studied before fascinated audiences. Sainte-Anne was newer, intended as a modern psychiatric hospital, but by the 1890s it, too, struggled with the same problems of overcrowding and underfunding. Whichever institution the nurse in our story belonged to, the daily rhythms were much the same. The asylum was governed by order, not compassion. Patients rose early, often to the sound of bells or whistles, and were marched into communal dining halls for meals. Food was plain and often insufficient: broth, bread, a small portion of meat if one was fortunate. Those judged capable of work were put to labor, sewing, laundry, or maintenance tasks, under the rationale that structured activity would help restore sanity. The rest languished in barren wards, where time stretched endlessly. Doctors visited periodically, though rarely long enough to know their patients well. Their rounds were more inspections than conversations. The patients studied like specimens rather than individuals. Nurses and attendants carried the burden of care, but their authority was limited and their exhaustion constant. The ratio of staff to patients was shockingly low. One nurse might oversee dozens of men or women, many violent or disturbed, with little support. In such conditions, shortcuts were inevitable, and cruelty could flourish unnoticed. The architecture itself reinforced this atmosphere. Asylums were designed less for healing than for control. Tall stone walls encircled the grounds, punctuated by heavy gates. Wards were divided into long, echoing corridors lined with iron-barred windows. Dormitories packed patients together, sometimes 100 to a room. Solitary cells, small, bare, and windowless, were used to contain the most disruptive. The air was thick with disinfectant, sweat, and despair. For new arrivals, the first shock was often the sheer scale of the place, a small city of the forgotten, governed by routines that had little to do with the outside world. The ledger was the heartbeat of the asylum. Every admission, treatment, and death was carefully noted, not for the sake of humanity but for bureaucratic necessity. A patient was admitted with a name, an age, and a diagnosis. Their progress, or lack thereof, was summarized in clinical language. When they died, the cause was recorded in brief, often formulaic terms. The ledger was not a personal account. It was a record meant for administrators and inspectors, not for grieving families. In practice, it became the sole witness to thousands of lives lived and lost in confinement. It is within these ledgers that the nurse's shadow appears. Names of patients who passed under her care, one after another, marked by the same vague causes of death. Exhaustion, weakness, decline. Terms so elastic that they could describe anything, or conceal everything. To an administrator scanning columns of ink, nothing seemed out of place. High mortality was expected. But to anyone who looked closely, the repetition of her ward's deaths formed a troubling pattern. Why was this not recognized at the time? The answer lies in the nature of the asylum system itself. Death was routine. In some wards, mortality rates reached 1 in 5 annually. Malnutrition, untreated infections, and the spread of diseases like tuberculosis were relentless killers. Patients arrived already weakened, many after years of poverty, alcoholism, or abuse. When they died, no one was surprised. Their families rarely asked questions. Few had advocates. To the outside world, their lives and their deaths carried little weight. Oversight was minimal. Inspections were rare and often superficial, focused more on order and cleanliness than on patient welfare. Doctors and administrators, conscious of their reputations, had no desire to advertise scandal. If deaths seemed high, they could be blamed on epidemics, the climate, or the nature of mental illness itself. Staff who raised concerns risked their positions. Silence was safer. And so the pattern of mortality under one nurse's watch could pass unchallenged, masked by the overall gloom of the institution. But even in such darkness, whispers began. Other staff noticed that patients seemed to decline more quickly in her ward. Rumors circulated, muttered in corridors or over shared meals. Orderlies spoke of unusual instructions, of patients left unattended, of medicines administered with heavy hands. These were not accusations that could easily be proven. In a world where death was common, how could one prove that this death, and not the next, was unnatural? Still, the whispers were enough to mark her as a figure of suspicion. The asylum system of Paris in 1896 was not merely a backdrop to her story. It was the very stage that allowed it to unfold. Its overcrowded wards, its reliance on ledgers instead of human connection, its indifference to the fates of the marginalized, all combined to create an environment where secrets could be buried as easily as bodies. In such a place, a nurse with dark inclinations, or even just a weary nurse who had ceased to care, could become both healer and executioner, with no one to stop her. The glittering image of Belle Epoque Paris often blinds us to these realities. Yet for the thousands confined within asylum walls, the City of Light was a city of silence. Their voices were erased, their suffering hidden. And at the center of one ward, in the care of one nurse, patients entered and left only as names in a ledger, names soon followed by the same word, dead. Amid the towering stone walls of the Parisian asylums, staff moved like shadows, their names rarely preserved, their stories forgotten. Doctors sometimes gained fame, their lectures printed in journals, their discoveries celebrated in medical societies. But nurses were another matter. They were the invisible machinery of the asylum, feeding, washing, restraining, and, too often, burying. In the year 1896, one such nurse emerged from this anonymity, not because she sought recognition, but because her shadow fell darkly over the lives entrusted to her. Who was she, this woman whose name flickers only faintly in forgotten records? We cannot paint her portrait with certainty, but history allows us to sketch the outlines of her world. Most nurses in Paris at the time came from the lower classes. They were often women of modest backgrounds, drawn to the profession by necessity rather than vocation. Few had formal training. Instead, they learned by watching older staff, imitating routines, and enduring the grueling pace of ward life. Pay was meager, the hours long, and respect scarce. A nurse could expect exhaustion to be her constant companion, the smell of sickness her daily air, and the cries of the afflicted her nightly lullaby. To serve in an asylum was to live in an ambiguous space between compassion and control. Nurses were expected to show care, but also to maintain discipline. They were guardians as much as caregivers, responsible for order as well as healing. Their authority over patients was immense. A nurse decided when someone ate, when they were bathed, when they were sedated, and when they were restrained. This authority, unchecked and largely unseen, created both opportunity and temptation. Our nurse, let us imagine her walking the dim corridors of a ward. She wears the plain uniform of her station, a heavy dress, an apron often stained from the labors of the day, and a bonnet or cap that marks her as staff. In her hands she carries keys that jingle faintly, the sound of both access and control. She knows every creak of the floorboards, every shadow where a patient huddles, every smell that signals sickness or decay. To her superiors, she appears dutiful. She fills out the ledgers, noting deaths with neat but unremarkable handwriting. To her fellow nurses, she is one among many, enduring the same hardships, sharing the same small jokes in rare moments of rest. But to the patients, those who could still sense the world around them, she may have been something else entirely, a presence to be feared. It is in the pattern of deaths that her identity begins to emerge, a grim fingerprint hidden in ink. Patients under her care slipped away with unsettling regularity. Some were newly admitted, still young, still clinging to strength. Others were fragile, yet not yet at death's door. And yet, within weeks or even days of entering her ward, their names were crossed out in the ledger, replaced by short phrases: exhaustion, failure of the nerves, consumption. The repetition is haunting. It suggests not just the randomness of disease, but the hand of someone who knew how to disguise death as inevitability. But what of her motives? Was she a monster who sought power over life and death, like the so-called angels of death uncovered in later centuries? Or was she a weary woman who came to see her patients not as human beings but as burdens, their endless cries gnawing away at her compassion until she chose the path of indifference, or even mercy? History gives us no confession, no testimony, only silence. And silence can be more chilling than any words. It is worth noting that some contemporary accounts suggest she was unusually involved in burials. In most asylums, burial duties were handled by attendants or external workers. Nurses might prepare bodies, but they did not typically accompany them to the grave. Yet whispers claimed that she did. Was this dedication? A strange sense of duty to see her patients through to their final rest? Or was it a way of ensuring that what had happened within her ward remained hidden, carried with the body into the earth? To bury patients was also, symbolically, to bury secrets. Her life outside the asylum remains invisible to us. She may have lived in staff quarters on the asylum grounds, as many nurses did, sharing cramped dormitories with others. Or perhaps she returned each night to a small rented room in a working-class neighborhood, carrying with her the exhaustion and smells of the ward. She might have had family, perhaps a mother or siblings who relied on her wages. Or she may have been alone, the asylum both her workplace and her prison. Women in her position rarely married. The demands of their labor and the stigma of their environment kept them isolated. If she had children, they too would have lived in the shadow of the institution. What is striking is how little attention she attracted in official documents. No scandals made the newspapers, no inquiries left behind detailed transcripts. This is not the story of a nurse publicly tried and condemned. Instead, it is the story of a woman who moves silently through her duties, leaving only the faintest trace, a statistical anomaly in the rate of deaths, a rumor whispered by colleagues, a ledger line that today reads like a clue in a crime novel. In that silence lies the possibility that her actions were not only tolerated but invisible, swallowed by a system designed to bury both patients and their stories. The nurse herself, then, becomes almost a ghost. We cannot know her thoughts, her feelings, or her justifications. We can only reconstruct her shadow through the institutions that framed her life. And that shadow is disturbing enough. Whether by malice, by neglect, or by a twisted sense of mercy, she was present at the bedside of too many patients whose lives ended too soon. She may have believed she was relieving suffering, or she may simply have stopped seeing her patients as human at all. Both possibilities are terrifying, for they reveal how fragile the boundary between care and cruelty truly is. In every society, certain professions carry immense trust: teachers, priests, doctors, and nurses. We place our most vulnerable, children, the sick, the dying, into their hands. In the Paris of 1896, that trust was magnified by the secrecy of the asylum. The patients had no voices, no advocates. The ledger was their only witness. And in that ledger, this nurse appears again and again, her presence woven into the pattern of death. She was not famous, not remembered, not even clearly recorded. Yet her story forces us to look at the hidden side of medical history, where the line between healing and harm is blurred beyond recognition. She remains unnamed, but her shadow still lingers in the corridors of Paris's asylums, a reminder that even in the age of progress, the darkest truths could hide in plain sight. The asylums of Paris at the end of the 19th century were no strangers to death. Life expectancy for the institutionalized was tragically short, shaped by malnutrition, disease, neglect, and the despair that accompanied confinement. Records from this period show that in some wards nearly a third of patients died within a year of admission. In such an environment, death was not shocking, it was routine. But routine does not mean random, and when one looks carefully at the ledgers of 1896, an unsettling pattern emerges, as though a hidden hand were at work among the wards. In the fragile lines of the register, the details appear almost banal. A patient admitted in January, dead by March. Another, young and seemingly resilient, gone in less than a month. A third, whose health was steady upon admission, suddenly described as wasting away and buried within weeks. Each entry alone could be explained away: disease, weakness, bad fortune. But together, they form a mosaic too deliberate to dismiss. The intervals between admissions and deaths, the clustering of names under a single nurse's care, the eerily similar causes noted by physicians, all of these suggest that death in this ward was more than an accident of chance. Physicians of the time leaned heavily on vague diagnostic language. Terms like consumption, exhaustion, or decline of the nerves were common placeholders for deaths they could not, or would not, explain. In the ledgers, these phrases appear with mechanical regularity. Exhaustion, in particular, was a favored explanation, an umbrella term covering everything from tuberculosis to malnutrition to simple neglect. But to modern eyes, it raises suspicion. Why would patients who entered the asylum still relatively robust collapse so quickly, their lives reduced to the bland word exhaustion? Was it the harsh regime of the asylum itself, or something more deliberate? Food withheld, medicine misused, or worse? Patterns of death have long been a clue to hidden crimes. Centuries later, forensic researchers would develop statistical methods to uncover serial killers working within hospitals. Nurses whose patients died at inexplicably high rates, doctors whose wards recorded suspicious spikes in mortality. But in 1896, such methods did not exist. Administrators often chalked up such anomalies to coincidence, to the natural ebb and flow of disease. Yet even then, some may have noticed, some may have whispered, and some may have chosen silence, preferring to avoid scandal rather than confront the possibility that an agent of care had turned into an agent of death. It is possible, of course, that the nurse in question was not killing in the active sense but allowing patients to die through omission. A skipped feeding here, a withheld dose of medicine there, a failure to summon the physician when symptoms worsened. Such small acts of neglect would leave little trace, yet when repeated, they could turn survival into decline. In this interpretation, the pattern of deaths was engineered not by dramatic violence but by quiet indifference, a slow erosion of life carried out under the guise of care. And this kind of neglect would have been nearly impossible to detect. But there is another possibility, darker still, that the deaths were intentional, actively produced under the nurse's hand. At the time, asylums were stocked with dangerous substances: morphine, chloral hydrate, laudanum, medicines intended to calm or sedate the distressed. In high enough doses, these same drugs could kill. A syringe administered at night, a dose too strong for a weakened patient, a powder mixed into a drink. Such acts would leave behind no obvious mark, only the appearance of natural decline. Doctors, already expecting death, would rarely question it. A nurse who understood the tools at her disposal could, if she wished, decide who lived and who died. Yet the question of motive hangs heavy over this analysis. Why would she do it? Histories of so-called angels of death in later centuries often point to complex psychological drives: the thrill of power, the illusion of mercy, the twisted desire to be seen as a savior when reviving patients from crises of their own making. But in the Paris of 1896, another possibility presents itself: sheer exhaustion and resentment. Patients in asylums were demanding, unpredictable, sometimes violent. Staff were overworked, underpaid, and rarely thanked. In such conditions, cruelty could fester quietly, until life itself seemed less a sacred thing and more a burden to be managed. A nurse who saw her patients not as human beings but as obstacles might well convince herself that removing them was not only easy, but justifiable. The burial records only deepen the mystery. Repeatedly, this same nurse appears in connection with the interments of her patients. In most institutions, burial was a separate process, often handled by external workers or lower attendants. That she involved herself in this final step suggests something deliberate, either a morbid sense of ownership over the lives and deaths in her ward, or a need to ensure that the secrets of her patients remained safely sealed beneath the soil. Each funeral became not just a farewell but the erasure of evidence. To the administrators, these deaths may not have seemed unusual. After all, the asylum was a place of constant decay, its air thick with disease and despair. What was one more entry in the death register? What was one more burial? The system itself was complicit, swallowing human lives and spitting out only statistics. But to us, looking back, the patterns stand out starkly. Too many deaths, too quickly, too concentrated under one figure's shadow. In the end, the question may never be answered. Were these deaths merely the expected toll of asylum life, the grim but natural result of confinement and disease? Or were they engineered, shaped by the unseen hand of a nurse who had grown too comfortable with death's presence? The truth lies buried with the patients themselves, beneath the stones of Paris's cemeteries. Yet the silence of the records, the vagueness of the causes, and the repetition of her name all whisper the same chilling possibility, that in the asylum of 1896, death was not merely expected. It was, in some dark sense, designed. In Paris at the end of the 19th century, the streets bustled with horse-drawn carriages, cafes filled with smoke, and the electric hum of modernity creeping into daily life. Yet behind the high stone walls of the city's asylums, another world persisted, quiet, segregated, and forgotten. For the patients who died there, the final chapter of their lives did not end with mourning relatives or solemn processions through grand boulevards. Instead, their bodies were carried out discreetly, often under the cloak of night or early morning, and laid into shallow, anonymous graves. These burials were not acts of reverence but transactions, paperwork filed and duties completed, their human stories sealed beneath layers of soil. The nurse at the center of our tale did more than witness these burials. Records suggest she played a role in organizing, overseeing, even ensuring that certain patients were laid to rest quickly and without fuss. This in itself was unusual. Nurses rarely took part in the logistics of burial. That task was left to undertakers, attendants, or the asylum's contracted staff. But in 1896, this nurse's name repeatedly appears linked to burial documents, as though she was determined not only to guide her patients to death but also to shepherd them into silence. Why was this necessary? Part of the answer lies in the culture of the asylum. Patients were often estranged from their families, abandoned due to poverty, shame, or the belief that they were incurable. Few relatives came to claim their bodies. Fewer still demanded autopsies. For administrators, this was convenient. Less oversight, fewer questions, faster turnover. A patient could vanish into the earth almost as easily as they had disappeared into the institution itself. The nurse, therefore, may have seen burial as a continuation of control. Death was not the end of her authority. It was merely the beginning of a new form of possession. Contemporary burial practices for asylum patients were stark and utilitarian. Coffins were plain, often reused, sometimes replaced with nothing more than canvas wrappings. Graves were dug in long, trench-like rows at municipal cemeteries, each body numbered rather than named. Markers were temporary, if they existed at all. Within a few years, many graves were reused, bones lifted, and placed into ossuaries to make room for the next wave of forgotten souls. To the city above, the cemeteries remained serene gardens of stone and silence. To those beneath, it was an anonymous crowding of the dead. This anonymity suited the nurse's alleged methods. Each burial erased a story. Each unmarked grave removed the possibility of questions. If a patient had been allowed to die, or helped along to it, there would be no autopsy, no grieving family to demand accountability, no priest to linger with uncomfortable inquiries. Instead, the ground closed over the patient, and with it, the truth. Silence beneath the earth became the perfect accomplice. There is something unsettling about the intimacy of her role. To care for someone in life, to watch them weaken, to stand beside their deathbed, and then to arrange their burial, this cycle gave her a disturbing completeness of control. She was present at every stage, from suffering to silence. For some, this might seem an extension of duty. For others, it is evidence of obsession. Did she feel satisfaction in ensuring that the story was tied neatly at both ends? Did she believe she was offering closure, or was she indulging in a darker form of ownership, ensuring that no one else could interfere with the fate she had decided? We cannot ignore the ritualistic undertones here. Burial has always carried with it layers of symbolism, release, cleansing, finality. But when controlled by a single individual, especially one suspected of engineering the deaths themselves, the ritual becomes something else. It becomes the sealing away of secrets. Each grave she oversaw was not only a resting place but a lockbox, containing not just bones but evidence, guilt, and the unanswerable questions of intent. Parisian cemeteries of the period only amplify this eerie quality. The sprawling rows of Père Lachaise and Montmartre Cemetery attracted mourners for famous poets and painters, yet the burial grounds for asylum patients remained peripheral, tucked away in quieter corners of the city. Here, the forgotten dead accumulated in silence, their stories erased by time and indifference. Somewhere among them lay the patients of 1896, the names scribbled in ledgers but lost to stone and soil. Their graves tell us nothing, but their absence from history tells us everything, that they were never meant to be remembered. To imagine these burials is to picture a scene of stark efficiency, a handful of attendants lowering a simple coffin, the scrape of shovels filling the air, the nurse standing close by with folded hands, perhaps uttering no prayer at all. No flowers, no procession, no mourning family. Just the earth swallowing another body, as though it had all been inevitable. The city above carried on, laughter in the cafes, music drifting from cabarets, while just beneath its soil, lives were being erased without witness. The chilling thought is that the nurse may have relied on this contrast. Paris's surface life was vibrant, its progress celebrated. But beneath, in cemeteries and asylums, a quieter, darker economy of death unfolded, unnoticed by those who preferred to look the other way. The burials she touched were not aberrations but reflections of a society that had decided some lives were worth forgetting. In that sense, she was both participant and product of her time, a custodian of silence in a culture already predisposed to it. Yet when we trace these burial records now, the repetition of her involvement feels like a ghostly fingerprint, pressing against history. Why did her name keep appearing? Why was she there, again and again, ensuring the earth closed swiftly over her patients? Was it dedication to duty, or the last step in a hidden ritual of control? The ledgers give no answer, only the faint impression that what was buried was not just the dead, but the truth itself. And so the cemeteries of Paris hold not only the remains of patients but the echoes of suspicion. Their silence is not peaceful, it is accusatory, a void that demands questions even as it denies answers. Somewhere beneath the earth, the patients of 1896 remain, their secrets interred with them. And standing beside those graves, in our imagination if not in fact, is the figure of a nurse whose story unsettles because it refuses to resolve. She is caretaker, witness, and perhaps executioner, all roles culminating in the simple act of burial. With each grave she oversaw, she ensured not just the end of a life but the continuation of a silence that lingers still. Rumors, in institutions like the Paris asylums of 1896, moved quietly, like drafts through the long corridors, invisible yet impossible to ignore. Staff were trained to keep their heads down, to obey orders, to maintain silence about what they saw. Yet even in a world so accustomed to suffering and death, unease had a way of seeping into daily routine. It began as small observations, a patient who seemed healthy fading too quickly, a nurse's presence always aligned with sudden declines, or the unnerving fact that she also arranged their burials. These observations did not form accusations at first. They were whispers, exchanged between attendants over midnight meals or murmured in the laundry rooms where secrets tended to spill. In an asylum, the boundary between madness and sanity was already fragile. When a patient cried out that the nurse was poisoning them, was it a delusion or a desperate truth? Staff learned to dismiss such claims, filing them under paranoia, delusion, hysteria. But some accusations struck too close to reality to be ignored. The idea that a caregiver could become a harbinger of death was both unthinkable and strangely familiar. After all, the patients were already considered disposable by society. To accuse a nurse outright risked ridicule, dismissal, or worse, loss of employment. Yet behind closed doors, suspicions grew. The patients themselves were not blind to patterns. Even in their fragile states, they noticed who among them disappeared. They saw who last received the nurse's attention before falling silent forever. Some grew fearful, begging not to be placed in her care, resisting meals or medicine she offered. Their refusals were dismissed as symptoms of their illness, yet from our vantage point, their resistance reads differently, as the intuition of those who understood their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. Whispers of fear echoed down the wards, drowned out by official records but carried forward in atmosphere and dread. Doctors, too, may have felt the stirrings of doubt. A physician reviewing the ledgers could not have missed the cluster of deaths under one nurse's watch. But what would it mean to act on that suspicion? To confront her risked not only scandal but the exposure of the asylum's own failings. It was easier, safer, to attribute the deaths to exhaustion or decline, to label them natural and unavoidable. For some, silence was not cowardice but self-preservation, a way of protecting careers and reputations. The institution itself became an accomplice, not by commission but by omission. Still, Not all whispers stayed contained. Paris was a city of gossip, and stories had a way of slipping through the walls. Attendants with looser tongues may have carried tales into the cafes, sharing their unease after long shifts. Families who visited their institutionalized relatives sometimes left unsettled, sensing the uneasiness in the wards, the way other patients glanced fearfully at the nurse. Even if they could not name the suspicion, they felt it. Rumors, once planted, spread like vines. This atmosphere of unease had another consequence. It blurred the line between reality and paranoia. Some staff genuinely feared her, seeing shadows where perhaps none existed. Others exaggerated the rumors, turning her into a figure of folklore within the asylum. Half nurse, half spectre, a woman whose presence foretold death. In such a climate, truth and fear fed each other until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Whether she was guilty of calculated murders or merely guilty of neglect, her reputation began to take on a life of its own. There is something profoundly human in this response. Institutions thrive on silence, but individuals cannot help but talk. Gossip, after all, is often a survival tool. By whispering their fears, the attendants created a network of shared caution. By sharing suspicions, the patients tried to warn one another. Whispered words may not have been enough to stop the deaths, but they carved out a subtle resistance to the suffocating indifference of the system. In a place where lives were routinely erased, whispers kept memory alive, if only fleetingly. The unsettling part is that these suspicions never crystallized into action. There was no great scandal, no headline in the Parisian press, no inquiry that forced the asylum to confront its shadows. Instead, the whispers remained whispers, dying down as time moved forward and the city found new stories to obsess over. But their presence in the background of this tale is crucial. They remind us that people noticed, even if they did nothing. They remind us that silence is rarely ignorance, it is often fear. The image of this nurse walking the halls, her keys jingling at her side, patients recoiling slightly as she passed, staff exchanging sidelong glances when she entered the room. This is not just a reconstruction of events, but a reconstruction of atmosphere. It is the weight of suspicion pressing down on a place already heavy with despair. The whispers were never loud enough to shatter the asylum's walls, but they linger like ghosts, testifying to the fact that even in a culture of silence, the human instinct to question and fear could not be fully extinguished. And yet, as quickly as whispers rise, they vanish. Without proof, without confrontation, they dissolve into the background of history, leaving us with only fragments and echoes. Today, when we examine the ledgers and burial records, we are left with the same uneasy feeling that those attendants and patients must have carried: suspicion without certainty, whispers without answers. The story of 1896 does not survive in confessions or in sensational newspaper reports. It survives in something far colder, far less human: a ledger. Ink on yellowing paper, neat columns of names, dates, and causes of death. At first glance, it is nothing more than administrative bookkeeping, the kind of dull record that bureaucracies depend on to keep order. Yet when read carefully, these pages transform. They become the closest thing we have to testimony, the mute voices of patients preserved not in memory but in accounting. Each entry follows a pattern: the name of the patient, their age, the date of admission, the date of death, and a brief notation explaining the cause. Exhaustion. Decline. Chronic illness. The language is clinical, detached, almost antiseptic. But within this monotony lies something deeply unsettling. The repetition of vague causes, the compression of time between arrival and death, the recurrence of one nurse's involvement, all of it reads like a hidden code, a cipher of suffering waiting to be deciphered. For modern readers, the ledger is more than a record, it is evidence. In the absence of witnesses, in the silence of cemeteries where no gravestones remain, this book of names is the only surviving voice of those who vanished inside the asylum. And when we trace the pattern, the story it tells is chilling. Patients did not simply die. They died quickly. They died predictably. They died under circumstances that point not to chance but to a deliberate rhythm of mortality. Historians and forensic scholars today often return to documents like these to uncover what contemporary institutions refuse to admit. Statistical analysis, something unheard of in 1896, can now reveal anomalies invisible at the time. Too many deaths in too short a span, too closely clustered under the same caretaker, are no longer dismissed as coincidence. They form a fingerprint, subtle but undeniable, of interference. In this way, the ledger acts not only as a record but as a witness, its silent testimony more damning than any accusation whispered in the corridors. Consider the detail of burial notations. Where other nurses' names fade after the point of death, this nurse's appears again in the margins of burial records, as if she followed her patients from bed to grave. The administrators may not have seen this as unusual at the time, but for us it is a striking anomaly. Why was she so consistently tied not just to the act of care but to the act of final disposal? Why did her presence extend beyond duty into ritual? The ledger does not answer these questions outright, but it frames them in stark relief. There is also the matter of omissions. What is missing from the ledger is as revealing as what is present. Autopsies are rarely mentioned. Specific diseases are often absent. The lack of detail shields the asylum from scrutiny, but it also obscures the humanity of the patients. Their stories collapse into 2 dates and a single word of explanation. In this void of detail, the possibility of hidden acts flourishes. After all, if nothing is documented, then everything becomes possible. The silence of the ledger becomes a canvas onto which suspicion is projected. To hold such a book today, if it still survives in the archives of Paris, would be to hold both evidence and accusation in one's hands. The ink may have faded, the pages may have grown brittle, but the story remains embedded in its numbers and names. Each line is a grave. Each column is a cemetery of forgotten lives. The power of the ledger is not in what it explains but in what it refuses to explain. It forces us to ask questions that history deliberately left unanswered. And yet, one must also remember the nature of evidence. The ledger cannot tell us intent. It cannot whisper motive or describe the thoughts of the nurse as she bent over her patients. It cannot confirm whether she acted out of malice, neglect, or a misguided sense of mercy. What it can do is show us the rhythm, the steady toll of lives extinguished in her orbit. In the courtroom of history, that rhythm may not be proof beyond doubt, but it is damning enough to haunt. The unsettling irony is that in 1896, this ledger would have been seen as protection, not accusation. Administrators prized orderly documentation as a shield against scandal. If every death was written down, then the asylum had done its duty, no matter how vague the explanation. What they did not realize, or perhaps did not care to realize, was that this very neatness would one day betray them. The ledger they used to prove normality has become, for us, a record of abnormality. In a way, the ledger is the patient's only surviving voice. They could not speak for themselves, and society did not care to listen. But the ink lines endure, whispering their presence across more than a century. When we trace them, we find more than bureaucratic neatness. We find shadows, patterns, and the outlines of a story that the asylum tried to bury but could not erase. Perhaps this is the cruelest truth. The evidence survives not because anyone wanted it to, but because bureaucracy demanded it. These patients were not memorialized out of compassion but logged out of necessity. And yet, against all odds, these mechanical notes have preserved something their caretakers never intended. A glimpse of the horror that unfolded under the watch of a nurse who seemed to hold death in her hands. The ledger does not lie. But it does not tell the full truth either. It exists in that liminal space where evidence and silence overlap, where we see enough to be disturbed but never enough to be certain. It is a book that accuses without naming the crime, a record that haunts without resolving. And perhaps that is why it endures as the most powerful artifact of this story. Because in its sterile columns, the dead of 1896 still speak, not with words, but with numbers. And numbers, once they form patterns, are very difficult to ignore. When we try to understand the figure of the 1896 nurse, we are confronted with an unsettling paradox. On paper, she was a caregiver, an individual entrusted with the responsibility of tending to the vulnerable, the sick, and the forgotten. But between the lines of the ledger, another portrait emerges, that of a woman who seemed to hover at the threshold between life and death, her presence repeatedly tied to patients who never recovered. Was she merely a weary servant of a brutal system, shaped by exhaustion and indifference? Or was she something more chilling, a predator cloaked in the garments of compassion? To build her psychological profile, we must begin with the context. Nurses in 19th century asylums were not the trained professionals we imagine today. Many came from working-class backgrounds, hired with little formal education, taught discipline before medicine. Their daily existence was defined by grueling hours, paltry wages, and the emotional burden of caring for patients who were considered irredeemable by society. In such conditions, compassion could curdle into resentment. It is not difficult to imagine a nurse growing numb to suffering, her humanity eroded by endless repetition. From this angle, the nurse of 1896 may have been less a monster than a casualty herself, someone who learned to view death as routine, even convenient. But the consistency of the patterns tied to her care complicates this picture. Neglect might explain some deaths. Fatigue might explain her indifference. Yet what explains her unusual involvement in burials? Her presence at every stage of the patient's decline. This detail suggests more than resignation. It hints at a degree of control, even satisfaction, in seeing the cycle of life and death through to its conclusion. Here we step into darker territory, the psychological terrain of those later dubbed angels of death, medical staff who orchestrated deaths under the guise of care. Modern psychology has identified several motivations behind such figures. Some act out of what they perceive as mercy, ending the suffering of those they believe are beyond hope. Others are driven by power, intoxicated by the ability to decide who lives and who dies. Still others are compelled by ritual or compulsion, repeating the cycle of care and killing until it becomes part of their identity. In the case of the Paris nurse, we cannot assign her neatly to one category, but the echoes are unmistakable. The ledger's patterns suggest deliberation, not accident. Her repeated role in burials suggests obsession, not duty. There is also the question of how she was perceived. Whispers among attendants and patients, fearful glances, and the aura of unease surrounding her all point towards someone who radiated something uncanny. Predators in positions of care often cultivate precisely this mixture of authority and dread. To some, she may have seemed stern, efficient, indispensable. To others, she was a figure to be avoided, her footsteps in the corridor a sound that chilled the ward. Such duality, nurturer to some, terror to others, is a hallmark of individuals who conceal predatory impulses behind professional roles. We must also consider the possibility of a fractured psyche. The late 19th century was rife with discussions about hysteria, insanity, and the thin line between health and madness. Could it be that the nurse herself, immersed daily in the asylum's darkness, was not entirely stable? Some predators in caregiving roles are driven by unresolved trauma, by inner compulsions that they themselves may not fully understand. Was she aware of her actions, or did she justify them under a distorted sense of duty? The historical silence makes it impossible to know, but the possibility lingers, that she was both caretaker and patient in her own way, consumed by the very madness she was meant to control. Her psychological profile also forces us to confront society's complicity. She did not operate in isolation. She worked within a system that normalized suffering, that expected frequent deaths, that buried patients in anonymity. In such an environment, a predatory nurse could thrive undetected. The institution itself became her camouflage. This does not absolve her, but it deepens the profile. She was not only shaped by personal impulses but also by the permissive shadows of a society that had already abandoned its most vulnerable. Ultimately, whether she was a weary nurse numbed by despair or a deliberate predator disguised as a healer, the effect was the same. Patients under her care died at alarming rates, their stories swallowed by silence. Her psychological portrait is unsettling precisely because it resists resolution. She may have been both, caregiver and killer, servant and sovereign, victim and perpetrator. The duality is what makes her figure so haunting. What lingers most, though, is the image of her standing by as patients slipped away, her face unreadable, her hands steady. To some, she might have appeared as a guardian angel offering final comfort. To others, she was the silent presence of death itself. The truth of her psychology remains buried, like her patients, beneath layers of earth and time. But the ledger, the whispers, and the patterns allow us to sketch a silhouette, a woman who blurred the line between nurse and predator, compassion and cruelty, duty and obsession. And perhaps that is the most terrifying aspect of all, that within the same uniform, within the same role, both identities could coexist. To the world, she was a nurse. To those who feared her, she was something else entirely. To history, she remains an enigma, her mind as shadowed as the hall she walked. The temptation, when examining the disturbing case of the 1896 Paris nurse, is to view her as an isolated figure, a rogue presence within an otherwise orderly institution. Yet to do so would be to ignore the larger, more unsettling truth. She thrived not in spite of the asylum system but because of it. The conditions, the hierarchy, the bureaucracy, and the indifference of society all formed the perfect environment in which her shadow could grow. To understand her story, we must widen the lens from the individual to the institution itself, to the machinery of neglect that turned human suffering into routine, and death into paperwork. The Parisian asylum of the late 19th century was not a sanctuary of healing but a warehouse of misery. Patients were not admitted with the expectation of recovery, but rather confined with the assumption of permanence. Many were considered incurable, burdens to their families and to society. The asylum was their final home, often their final prison. Such an atmosphere fostered resignation among staff and a culture of containment rather than care. Within this framework, deaths were neither rare nor shocking. A patient who wasted away quietly in the night did not trigger alarm. It simply added another line to a register, another burial in the institutional cemetery. This normalization of death created fertile ground for predators. In environments where mortality is expected, individual responsibility becomes diffuse. A nurse could be present at an unusual number of deaths without raising immediate suspicion, because death itself was an everyday occurrence. The system's very indifference shielded her. Questions that might have arisen in a hospital or private home went unasked in an asylum where the unwanted were hidden from public view. In this way, the institution was not just complicit, it was enabling. Bureaucracy further compounded the problem. Asylums were drowning in paperwork, ledgers of admissions, discharges, deaths, supply lists, staff schedules. Ironically, this flood of documentation often obscured rather than revealed the truth. Deaths were recorded, yes, but rarely investigated. The nurse's careful attention to burials could easily be framed as diligence. Her repeated presence at the end of patients' lives explained a simple assignment. The records preserved her involvement but not her intent. In this way, the institution's obsession with statistics became a mask, hiding the human suffering behind columns of ink. The hierarchy within the asylum also provided cover. Doctors, often more concerned with theories of madness than with the daily conditions of their patients, delegated much of the hands-on care to nurses and attendants. Nurses operated in a liminal space, seen as subordinate yet essential, overlooked yet ever-present. The nurse in question, therefore, had both access and invisibility. She was close enough to patients to influence their lives directly, but distant enough in the institutional hierarchy to avoid scrutiny. If complaints were made by patients, assuming they were even coherent or believed, they could be dismissed as delusions, the ramblings of the insane. Thus, the voices of the very victims were structurally silenced by the asylum's design. Society, too, bore responsibility. The asylum system existed not simply as a medical project but as a social one. Families who could not or would not care for mentally ill relatives sent them away, often with relief. Once confined, the patients ceased to exist in the public imagination. Out of sight, out of mind. This social abandonment reinforced the institution's autonomy. Few relatives visited regularly. Fewer still questioned the circumstances of deaths. Burials were anonymous, mourned only by staff who had long ago lost the capacity for sentiment. The nurse could operate in this void, surrounded by the forgotten, her actions unnoticed by a world that had already turned away. We must also consider the economic dimensions. Asylums were perpetually underfunded, expected to house growing numbers of patients with shrinking resources. Staff were stretched thin, supplies rationed, conditions deteriorating. Under such pressure, death became a grim convenience. Every patient who died was one less mouth to feed, one less bed to occupy. Administrators, whether consciously or not, benefited from a steady trickle of mortality. A nurse who seemed to manage death efficiently, ensuring burials were carried out without fuss, might even have been viewed as reliable. The system's quiet desperation thus aligned, chillingly, with the actions of the nurse herself. Then there is the cultural dimension. The late 19th century was an era fascinated by degeneration, by fears of hereditary madness, by the belief that some lives were less valuable than others. Eugenic thought was beginning to spread, and the asylum became a repository for those deemed unfit. In such a climate, the death of a patient was not just tolerated, it was tacitly accepted as natural, perhaps even beneficial. The nurse's actions, if indeed they crossed from neglect into predation, occurred within a broader framework that devalued the very lives she was tasked with protecting. Yet institutions leave traces, and the ledger is one of them. Ironically, it was the asylum's own compulsive record-keeping that later revealed the suspicious patterns. Though administrators may have overlooked her at the time, history could not. The ink preserved what whispers could not, that the same name recurred again and again beside the final breaths of patients. The same hand that fed them also guided them into silence. The same nurse who wrote burial notes may have written death itself into their lives. The complicity of the institution, however, does not absolve her. Rather, it underscores the most chilling lesson, that individuals like her do not act in a vacuum. They are shaped, shielded, and sometimes sustained by the systems around them. The Paris nurse may have chosen her path, but the asylum paved the road. Without its neglect, its bureaucracy, its indifference, her shadow might never have grown so long. In the end, the story of this nurse is not just about one woman in 1896. It is about the dark symbiosis between individual cruelty and institutional neglect. It is about how systems designed to contain suffering can become breeding grounds for it. It is about how silence, whether from patients, staff, or society, allows horrors to unfold in plain sight. And perhaps most disturbingly, it forces us to ask, how many others, in other institutions, thrived in the same shadows? How many nurses, attendants, or doctors carried secrets to the grave, protected by the very systems meant to guard against them? The Paris Asylum may have recorded this one story in its ledger, but the silence of countless others remains unbroken. When we peel back the faded pages of the Asylum ledger, we confront a question that refuses to leave. How much of this story belongs to fact, and how much to the realm of whispered legend? The ledger is undeniably real, its entries penned in the ink of a long-dead administrator, the neat columns marking lives reduced to dates and outcomes. But the interpretation surrounding the nurse, the suggestion of patterns, the aura of deliberate death, the possibility of predation, these have grown beyond the paper, taking on the qualities of folklore. In trying to separate truth from myth, we are left hovering in that unsettling space where history and horror entwine. The first challenge is the incompleteness of the record. A ledger captures data but not detail. It lists who died, when they died, and often where, but not always how. It was not designed to raise alarms, only to preserve statistics. The fact that the nurse's name appeared so frequently may indeed point to something sinister, but it might also reflect the realities of her assignment, her shift, her ward. Records from the time are riddled with ambiguities. Did she truly preside over more deaths than anyone else, or did she simply work in the sections where the most fragile patients were confined? The absence of corroborating evidence ensures the ledger is not a confession but a riddle. And yet, oral histories complicate matters further. In the years after her service, stories circulated among attendants and former patients' families. They spoke of the nurse's uncanny presence, of her cold efficiency at funerals, of the fear she inspired in those she tended. Such whispers, once passed from mouth to mouth, inevitably grew more dramatic. A woman who seemed stern could become cruel in retelling. A death coinciding with a shift might transform into a murder in the minds of those desperate to explain their loss. This is how folklore is born, not in lies, but in shadows, in the places where truth cannot fully be seen. The Paris of 1896 was a city steeped in superstition as well as science. Spiritualism was popular, seances were fashionable, and the notion of death's lingering presence captivated the public. Against this cultural backdrop, the idea of a nurse who carried death in her wake fit neatly into popular imagination. She could be interpreted not merely as a cruel caregiver but as a kind of reaper figure, a woman who stood between worlds. The ledger, instead of just being a bureaucratic tool, became evidence of her supposed supernatural aura. Thus the story of the nurse slipped beyond fact, acquiring mythic undertones. Later historians and writers found the story irresistible. The ledger's cold data offered a foundation, while the gossip and superstition of the time provided flesh. Each retelling added detail, her face described as gaunt, her eyes as hollow, her presence as ghost-like. Soon she was less a nurse and more a phantom haunting the asylum. In this way, history itself became complicit in her myth-making, unable to resist the pull of narrative. The ledger ceased to be just an artifact and became instead a talisman of unease, a reminder of the porous line between care and cruelty. But why do such stories persist? Partly, it is because they give shape to anxieties we cannot otherwise articulate. The asylum was a place society wanted to forget, a dumping ground for those it deemed undesirable. To imagine a nurse preying on patients is horrifying, but it is also clarifying. It offers a villain, a single face to blame, rather than confronting the broader guilt of institutional neglect. In this way, folklore becomes a coping mechanism. By making the nurse into a monster, society absolved itself of complicity. It was easier to fear her than to face the truth of its own abandonment of the vulnerable. At the same time, the endurance of her story speaks to the deep human fascination with caregivers who betray their role. There is something profoundly unsettling about those meant to heal becoming instruments of harm. We expect danger from criminals, from strangers, From enemies, but from nurses? From those who hold our lives in their hands while we are at our weakest. That inversion of trust is what keeps such stories alive, feeding the folklore across generations. The Paris nurse, whether guilty or not, embodies this archetype. The ledger itself has since been displayed in exhibitions, cited in articles, and whispered about in dark history circles. For some, it is a historical document. For others, it is a haunted object, a record that carries with it the weight of restless souls. In archives, visitors have reported a chill when handling its pages, as if the ink itself carried memory. Such reactions blur the boundary between fact and myth, turning the ledger from paper into relic, from record into symbol. So where does the truth lie? The sober historian must admit we may never know. The evidence is too thin, too fragmented, too clouded by time and retelling. The nurse may have been a weary woman caught in a web of circumstance, unfairly transformed into a predator by rumor. Or she may indeed have been something darker, a figure who exploited the asylum shadows to satisfy impulses we can only guess at. The ledger does not tell us which. It only leaves us with questions. And yet, perhaps that is its enduring power. Certainty would have ended the story. Ambiguity keeps it alive. The nurse's legacy is not just in what she may or may not have done, but in the fact that she continues to haunt imagination. She lives not in confession but in the silence between words, not in evidence but in suggestion. In this way, the ledger has outgrown its creators. It is no longer merely an institutional record. It is a doorway into the uncanny, a bridge between the factual and the folkloric, the historical and the haunting. In the end, the truth may be less important than the shadow, because whether nurse or predator, scapegoat or monster, she endures. And every time the ledger is opened, every time her name is read aloud, her story slips once again into the present, refusing to remain buried with her patients.